So the judging is complete, 3 days. It's been a really interesting few days. Ali, what are your overall impressions at the end of those 3 days?
In a short sentence, in 2 words, very impressed, actually. This is my second trip to Georgia, second visit here, and the first was 4 years ago, 4 to 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly, and I have seen a qualitative leap forward in those 4 to 5 years. Definitely. I think generally the one thing I found in my last visit was occasionally there were wines that had hygiene issues that were unclean. We've seen a lot less of that this year in the wines of Georgia. So there's been a huge step forward, and also there's been a huge step forward in the top end of the wines. We've found some absolutely world-class wines during the last 3 days judging. So I've been thoroughly impressed with what I've seen.
Yeah, I would personally echo that as well. And it's my second visit to Georgia too, and really great to be able to take a view across the spectrum of quality. Kat, you're probably more sensitive to things like hygiene as an experienced retail buyer than anyone else. What's been your assessment overall?
I think, as Ali said, I was really pleased to see so very few kind of hygiene faults coming through in the wines from Georgia. There still were some potentially issues with oxidation, which perhaps need looking at. If you get feedback from us as a kind of group of wine judges that your wine is slightly oxidised, that's definitely something to kind of look at and consider in detail. But overall, really great quality. And I think for me, some of the top flight wines that we awarded golds to were truly standout and actually just incredibly memorable in terms of the kind of the aromas that you get in the glass and the real personality of the individual grapes, and just have a real hallmark and a very distinctive from this one country in the world. So yes, they are qualitatively very much up there with the best wines in the world, but they have an individuality sort of stamped onto them, which is just fantastic to see.
And that individuality is something I know you're very enthusiastic about. Will, what is your feeling after 3 days?
I mean, to echo the point, the standards of the wines in general has been a lot higher than I think most people are expecting, but for me it was the quality of the diversity of wines as well. There's so many different styles on show, and not just styles from one variety to another, but regionally. We're starting to see a lot more identifiable typicity between where grapes are coming from. The kind of winemaking decisions are very, very clear in the glass, and it's really encouraging to see this kind of diversity.
Yes, and beautiful nuances within individual styles of wine as well.
And as well, if I can just add something, I think looking at other, I'm going to say emerging countries, but of course we understand that the history that there is with Georgia, and it is an old and a new country, as we all know, so that there's a resurgence in the old techniques. But in many ways it is an emerging and a renaissance in a new country. One thing that really struck me was the use of the really quite judicious use of oak. And I found with many other what I would call emerging countries, often they are quite heavy-handed with that, and I thought actually that the use of oak was really quite restrained. There's still some wines that need a bit of work, but that was for me, very pleasing.
So we've seen plenty of Saperavi, as you would expect, given its dominance of grape varieties in Georgia and its heritage, of course. A grape variety, I think, that's got enormous sort of potential with consumers.
Yeah, most definitely. In terms of the overall style, I think for me it's very obviously a very kind of rich, ripe, juicy grape variety with a load of character, and that's exactly what kind of consumers are looking for. Stylistically, I think the most successful wines that we have tasted have been where there has been really intelligent management of tannin. Obviously, as a big, rich grape variety, it's quite easy to verge into very extracted and to get very drying tannins. So, as I said, the more successful wines are where that tannin has been really reined in. It's ripe, it's adding a bit of grip, but it's not dominant, and there's still really lovely, fresh acidity on the finish, so that you get a lovely kind of juiciness.
Ali, what do you reckon on Saperavi from your experience and MW perspective?
I'd agree very much with what Kat says. I think it's a great variety that will appeal to many people, and that I think is one of its star qualities. In a way, likening it to something like something like Malbec, in a way that it's user friendly, it's accessible for people at the beginners, dare I say it, without meaning to sound patronising, but perhaps the less engaged consumers, yet right the way up to very engaged consumers and professionals. I think it has a lot to offer. So I think as a grape variety as itself, it has huge potential. I do very much agree with what Kat says. It does need to be treated carefully. You need to be careful not to extract too much. But it's a very juicy, wild, inviting grape variety, and it also clearly has the ability to age very well. Very, very well indeed. We tasted a couple of wines that were 12, 13 years old, and still very youthful. So I think I think it's a great variety with great potential. It's also easy to pronounce.
Yes.
Which and I'm semi tongue in cheek, but I do it's something that us Anglophiles can say relatively easily. So I think it's a great variety I like very much. Very much indeed.
That would be your take as well, Will?
100%. And I just want to focus on the age worthiness of the grape a little bit more, because we're probably much more used to drinking it in its youth when it is available in the UK, but we tried 2015s, 13s, we had some old wines, and it's really remarkable that the kind of the dry fruit nature, the herbaceous style it has. It's still appealing, it still has this kind of mass appeal, but the complexity it can develop is really fascinating. So I think in the future, when there's more examples of these wines and people can really start to kind of put the work in and to see how it's going to go, we're going to see some really exciting examples in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Give it time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Overall, of course, several hundred grape varieties indigenous to Georgia, all available in the museum vineyard. But focusing on those key varieties, I personally am a big fan of Kisi. I think it's beautiful in Kvevri wines, and it also has, as a sort of light modern European wine, it has enormous potential. Anyone else up for Kisi?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think it does very well in the Kvevri styles, but in non-Kvevri as well. I think it's got this lovely aromatic. It's floral and aromatic, but not overtly so in the way of, let's say, Torrentesca Gewürztraminer can be. So I think it's got this lovely, more restrained florality than those grape varieties. Looking perhaps with a minerality on the palate, looking more towards the Gruner Veltliner or something like that. So I think that it's a grape variety that will appeal. Is very much online with what's kind of trendy at the moment, say Gruner, Albarino, those kind of grape varieties that are accessible, are light, are not overtly anything, but have a really pure, crisp acidity and linear character on the palate.
Kind of Pitbull.
Yes.
Pitbull.
Yeah, and actually, worth saying as well, isn't it, Kat? From a shelf perspective, Kisi is easy to say.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It very definitely is, and that is such a key point for consumers. Actually, just being able to pronounce something, it also means it's more memorable, because you can, pronounce it, you can remember it, you can go back to the shelf and think, actually, yes, that is the grape variety that I did try and I did enjoy.
Yeah, and then plenty of Ricatatelli.
Yeah, we found some exceptional examples of Ricatatelli, even with a few years' development as well in the bottle, which was very exciting. It can become almost Fernand Pires-esque and a bit more opulent and rich as it ages. But in terms of some of the other Kvevri wines we tried, żიური in particular, wonderfully spicy, great texture it can have as well. It's one of my favourites I found in Kvevri. We were pleasantly surprised by another grape, Mtsvaviani Khachuri, but that's a little trickier for consumers to probably be able to get across. But the elegance that we found in that kind of grape really did produce some of the best Kvevri wines we came across today. Yeah,
you were very keen on Mtsvaviani, weren't you? I can't quite pronounce it quite as well as Will. You've had quite a lot of practice, but that's quite a distinctive grape variety as well, isn't it?
Yeah, this is just adds to the confusion, because there's Mtsvaviani Khachuri, there's Mtswani, there's a few which are quite similar like this. And Mtswani in general is very aromatic, and I love that perfume it has, particularly in the kind of more modern style of winemaking, where it can just allow its aromas to sing. I always kind of liken it to a bit more muscatty, but with a little bit more
kind of complexity
and body and weight behind it. And then the Mtsvaviani Khachuri is, again, it has these wonderful aromas, but then just extra little bit of texture, which is why I think it works wonderfully in a Kvevri.
Yeah, but I'm just going to interject here. You say it beautifully, Will. The challenge, I'm going to ask Kat this if you don't mind. The challenge for a consumer who can't speak Georgian like Will can, how do Georgia face that potential hurdle?
I think it's about having a really good look at the rest of your branding. So in terms of actually making that really accessible, making sure you have some English words on the front of the bottle, a taste descriptor, making sure that your back label description is actually very accurate and is very consumer focused, in the sense of you're not necessarily talking about winemaking techniques or very complicated, grape names. You're giving very clear indications of what it tastes like, what they're going to find in the glass, and actually how they should enjoy it. So, food pairings, is it a wine that needs food? Does it, is it a light, crisp kind of pit pull style that you just have a glass of an evening? So it's kind of thinking about all of those messages about the wine that are not the name of the grape, and how you actually bring those forward to make a very commercially appealing proposition effectively, without being so reliant on the ability to pronounce something that we all recognise as difficult for an English speaker.
Yes, it's got to be beyond education in grape varieties and more, as you say, towards striking design and storytelling and good back label descriptions that are easy to engage with. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we can't talk about Georgian wines without talking about its great tradition, Qvevri winemaking. I know this, Will, is something that you're particularly enthusiastic about.
Big fan of. Yeah, absolutely. It gives such a unique character to the wines and these extra dimensions as they develop as well. Something we found was quite consistent was this umami kind of flavour which was coming through. Sometimes it presented itself as a kind of soya bean kind of thing, sometimes a little bit more on the Parmesan-y cheese way, but in a very desirable, subtle way. And the texture that can come from using a Qvevri as well is something you don't really get from other vessels as well. This wonderful integration of spice and tannin and this drying kind of finish they can have, which needs to be managed and needs to be controlled. But when it's done well, it really, really balances the wine out and can give you something pretty unique.
Yeah. And it's fair to say that crossing your top table, as it were, that there have been some very strong Qvevri wines, haven't there?
Some exceptional wines. I mean, really, really, truly exceptional. Wines that we all know that this, Qvevri or tinajas, as they call them in Chile, or amphora, there's distinct differences between different types of vessels, but this is something that has become widespread globally. Yet here it does seem to be different, the way that they manage it here. One thing I will add, and I'm totally with Will, I think the sort of the textural point that you get from the wines, but this sort of savoury umami character is fascinating. But the ability that these wines have to age again is quite remarkable, and I think that is a huge plus point, as well as we've talked about with Saperavi, but as well with the Qvevri wines. I think quite clearly they are wines very often that need to be drunk with food. I mean, most wines should be, but these wines, especially due to the to the grip, to the tannin, are wines that often that should really be drunk with food. But they offer such fantastic opportunities for pairing with food. So they're kind of a sommelier's dream, I think, because they can go with so many things, with cheese, and I think that is a huge plus point as well. But consumers need to sort of understand that, because I think that it's for an entry-level consumer, it might be a little bit difficult to understand that these are wines, with some people won't know what they are. But again, I think it comes down to packaging it properly and explaining to people what they are and reinforcing that cultural, historical, traditional factor which people really engage with.
Well, that's just it, isn't it? Kat, the sommelier's dream is very often the retailer's nightmare, isn't it?
It can be challenging, because the brilliant thing about a sommelier in a restaurant is it's a hand sell moment. He has the ability to give you the story, to give you the background, to explain exactly why this wine will go perfectly with this particular dish. So it's a very bespoke occasion. What you're given as a recommendation in a restaurant by a sommelier is exactly fitted to exactly what you've ordered. That's very different in a supermarket environment where you have a shelf, you have nobody really necessarily guiding you, all you have is a small ticket and a label. So for many people who don't have much understanding of wine, it's a bit of a potluck moment as to what they pick off the shelf, and then as to what they put it with themselves when they get home, that could be anyone's guess. So the more the guidance that you can give them to kind of help them on that journey, the better it will be in terms of kind of results, both in terms of sales, but also just kind of loyalty, because you'll have a customer who understands your wine and knows when to drink it.
And from that perspective, that back label again is going to really help, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And just very quickly, kind of coming back to the Qvevri point, I think for me, the one thing, my big takeaway about what's so unique and unusual about Qvevri wines is the fact that yes, it's an aging process in one sense, but it really allows aromatics and kind of perfume to remain in the wine. So it's a kind of winemaking technique and aging process that doesn't completely subsume the character of the grape. So you get the character of the grape coming through in a really beautiful and expressive way.
Yep.
So, in short, what do producers who are already doing a great job, we've agreed that, what do they need to do to elevate their wines further?
I think actually across both reds and Qvevri wines, one of the key messages I would give would be about managing tannin. It's very easy, as we've already mentioned, with Saperavi to end up with big extracted wines with quite grippy, chewy tannins. The same can be said of Qvevri wines, so the length of time for maceration, that kind of skin contact, can end up with a wine which is very pithy, verging on bitter and just quite drying. So, you know, the more successful wines that we've tasted and awarded medals to have had very sensitive management of tannin for reds and extract for whites, and they've also had really fresh acidity to balance. So it's all about thinking about that last sensation in the mouth. Is it juicy and fresh, or is it drying? And actually, if it's verging towards drying, you've probably extracted a bit too much.
Qvevri winemaking, notoriously difficult. Cleaning a Qvevri, notoriously painstaking. It's all so important though, isn't it? Well,
it's absolutely vital. It's something which is getting a lot more consistent, but we did come across a few wines today where there was evidence of something unclean on the nose and follows through on the palate, and that usually comes from some element of poor hygiene, often from not cleaning the inside of a Qvevri correctly, which is a tough task because of what they're made from. They do absorb and they kind of have a lot of residue stick on them, which needs cleaning properly. So there's a couple of ways. A lot of people more commonly use cherry wood. Cherry wood kind of bristle and bark on a stick is really good for kind of aggravating whatever's stuck on the inside, and it's done with a lot of precision to get that as clean as it can be, but it's very easy not to. There are even some very large Qvevris that people would go inside if you're small enough to fit through the top, and you can give it if you're brave enough to fit through the top as well, I should say.
Not a job for me.
Yeah, I think I might get stuck halfway, but it's done in some places.
And Ali, from your overview, what could they do to lift their wine still further?
Very much what echoing what Will and Kat have said. Make a concerted effort. Hygiene is fundamental. As I said before, we've seen a leap forward from when I was here, or I've seen a leap forward as of 4 or 5 years ago. Keep going, focus on that. Focus on drinkability as well. Certainly with Saperavi, as we talked about, it's a wine that it's multifaceted. It can age well. It does go well with oak if you're careful with it. You need to be careful with extraction, but it can we've had some really beautiful juicy styles. And I think, at a slightly lower price point, let's just get some Saperavi out there that's just gluggable and drinkable. And I think then you can help build the category as well. And sort of echoing, I likened it to Malbec earlier on. And again, looking at the lower end of Malbec, just wines that people can just drink and glug and enjoy. And I'd like to see some of those styles come through a bit more, just focusing on drinkability. And not trying too hard. But overall, I would just say keep on going with what they're doing, because I think the improvement over the past decade has been quite remarkable.
Yeah, and if they can make Saperavi the user-friendly wine that Malbec is, then that's just great potentially in terms of the market, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So let's focus on the UK market specifically. Kat, what are the opportunities for Georgia?
Well, I think, as we've just kind of previously mentioned, Saperavi in a very commercial, fruit-forward, juicy, soft, rounded style has a big overlap with the kind of red wines that a lot of UK consumers enjoy drinking, particularly those Malbec kind of lovers. Malbec as a grape variety is going like an absolute train in the UK, exponential growth year on year. So offering consumers something which is stylistically similar but a little bit different, it feels like a great next step. So I would definitely be backing a juicy, drinkable, soft Saperavi. In terms of the white wines, I definitely think kind of a Kisi, but done in a sort of in a modern kind of fresh European style, not in Qvevri. It's got those lovely aromatics, it's very crisp, the consumer who likes, Picpoul, Albarino, kind of Grüne Veltliner. It's an easily pronounced grape. So I think those are the sort of the two big kind of volume opportunities potentially.
And let's look at the other end of the scale, because you've got a specialism in sort of more niche wines. What is the way forward for selling the likes of your February wines?
There's certainly the element of the name, the pronounceability, the approachability of something like that is a big hurdle to overcome with a lot of consumers. But I think we have to put the trust in some of our more specialist suppliers and importers and specialist retail outlets and restaurants, where you've got time for the hand sell, you've got time to tell the story and talk about the wine, and if there's a scary word on the front of the label, you've got someone to help guide you and be able to say Mutsuviani Žიური, or even Ricattaseli can be a little daunting for some people, but I think that's a brilliant style of wine for the UK markets with its kind of zippy freshness in its youth. But yeah, I think once almost having your hand held into this first kind of foray into something a little too frightening perhaps, Mutsuviani Žjourd'hui is a good example. Žhui can often be a little easy for you to trip up over, but when people can kind of get around that, I think it opens the door to a whole world of exciting and unique wines for people to try.
But we have to remember as well that you mentioned there the independent specialists, etc., who can guide people. They have a loyal following of customers,
and they're growing.
They're growing, but there's so many independents that I know, so many people that I know that are not in the wine industry that are sort of semi-engaged or engaged consumers. They trust already these gatekeepers, their independents. They, so many of my friends, I always buy my wines from John, whoever it may be, and if John suggests something, they buy it. So I think we really need to as well make sure that those gatekeepers and those independents, etc., are engaged, and because they have a huge role to play in furthering the accessibility of Georgian wines to semi-engaged and engaged consumers. And
can do the hand sell in a way a sommelier can to an extent.
Yeah, and often don't even need to do much of a sell. They'll just send an email saying, we've got this, I know you, and they'll buy it. It's not that much hard work for those people that already have a following. So I think they're a key element in furthering Georgian wines in the UK. Yeah.
So the final question, what makes Georgia so special? I'm going to say first, because I just think it's plain and simple, it's still a wonderful voyage of discovery for wine lovers. I think that's a great USP myself. What do you think, Will? What's your take?
I agree with that element of discovery, and for me it's the fact that there is such a diversity to discover here, from grape varieties to regions to winemaking techniques. As Ali said earlier, Kvevari wines in its many different guises does exist around the world, but there's something unique about how they produce these, about how the final product is just developing, and it gets people excited to try something new. I get excited to talk about something new with people, and I think there's so much here to discover.
Yeah, and consumers really like that, don't they?
They absolutely do. I mean, a slightly more engaged wine consumer really wants to know about what's new, what's different, where can I take my wine glass around the world to find a new experience. So Georgia has a huge amount to offer in terms of that journey and sort of allowing customers to really explore. Yeah.
That traditional element, but also with that new novel element as well. But the one thing that we haven't mentioned yet that has struck all of us is the food culture here. It's just utterly remarkable. Yeah, it's one of the great unknown cuisines of the world, and I think that I just don't understand why there's not more Georgian restaurants around, because it's just truly remarkable. And I think it's food as well. I think we talked about it at supper last night. I think we talked about it, how actually it's delicate. It's food that most people can appreciate, and there's such a variety of foods that it's not too challenging, yet it's remarkable in its breadth and depth. And I think that's a message as well. And if people come to Georgia, they will be absolutely astonished at the food culture and the wine culture.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I'm old enough to remember Italian food being kind of introduced to the UK and then elevated, and then much more recently Spanish food being taken to a whole new level with British consumers. The same is true of Greek cuisine, and it's surely time for Georgia as well, isn't it, to have a far wider culinary presence in foreign markets.
Absolutely.